Okay, good afternoon everybody. Welcome to the afternoon session. We're going to kick off with our keynote speaker, Professor Martin Francis. Martin is... Okay, good afternoon everybody. Welcome to the afternoon session. We're going to kick off... Sorry, I'm just getting some feedback here. Professor Martin Francis. Martin is okay. I can't find the mute. Mute up there. I've done it. Good. Right. Okay, now we've hopefully solved the feedback question. So I'm not hearing myself again. Let's start again. Welcome to the afternoon session, which will be given by Professor Martin Francis. Familiar, I'm sure, to many of you for his work on the flyer, looking at aircrew culturally during the Second World War. And Martin is going to address us with the keynote this afternoon, and the title is "The Flyer Confronts the Post-War Age, Survival, Guilt and Politics." Martin, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for that introduction. And I should say, first of all, congratulations to Harry and Paul and everybody involved in setting up this conference. I think it's done an extraordinary job in really, really difficult circumstances. I think you can be really proud of what you've achieved. I should also say I'm really honored to be giving an address at the RAF Museum. I first came here in 1976. As a small boy, as an aficionado of the history of the RAF. I then obviously have subsequently been able to pursue that as an academic and came here as a researcher. And I also came back about a month ago, soon after the reopening, after the COVID lockdown. And again, I'd really like to offer my praise for the extraordinary work done by all the staff here at the RAF Museum in getting the place up and running again, and actually coaxing us back into the outside world after a sort of period where we'd been locked down. You made everything feel so safe and enjoyable, and I thank you for that. So the conference title was what inspired this paper, A World Transformed, 1945 to 1949. Obviously, that phrase is highly apposite. The violent upheaval of war was followed by a period of post-war dislocation. We have to think about geopolitics, an emerging division of the world into two Cold War blocs, the emergence of new regions of geopolitical significance, like the Middle East, the rise of US hegemony in the West, and the fact that also the Second World War had confirmed that Stalin's attempt to fashion the Soviet Union into an industrial superpower had indeed succeeded. The growing evidence of the inability of the European nations to retain their overseas empire. Obviously, we think of Britain giving up the Indian subcontinent in 1947, but also remember by the end of the decade, the Dutch were quitting Indonesia and the French were leaving Madagascar. The immediate post-war years in Britain were also marked by what many went as far as to define as a social and political revolution. Labour's dramatic 1945 electoral victory, the shattering of interwar conservative hegemony, and the emergence of a new post-war settlement which envisioned dramatic expansion in the public sector and industry and the introduction of a vast and new comprehensive system of state welfare. However, I would like to argue that the years 1945 to 49 was also a world that had not yet fully settled into the clear and legible patterns that were to be in place by the 1950s. There was, I think, a decided unfixity about the years 1945 to 1950. The coordinates of the post-war world were emerging, but they were not yet securely fixed. Now, I'm not claiming any credit for this observation. My notion of the tenuousness of the post-war world is, in fact, actually a phrase adopted by Edith Schaeffer in her study, Burned Bridge, How East and West Germans Made the Iron Curtain. And two highly regarded authoritative general surveys, Mark Wazauer's 1999 Dark Continent and Tony Jutt's 2005 Post-War, both, I think, highlighted the myriad vulnerabilities that marked the post-war era. An awareness of this tenuousness has been much more evident in studies of continental Europe than it has been in studies of Britain in this period. But even the most superficial look at British culture in the late 1940s, I think, would reveal evidence of this, what I call sort of conditionality, this sort of notion of an unsettled world. We have to think about that many people actually, in the period immediately after the Second World War, actually feared a rapid revival of fascism. As Europe faced starvation and dislocation, there was a belief that actually fascism might actually very quickly revive. Many people were still more preoccupied with the threat of that than they were with the threat of Soviet communism. We also have to think, I think, that the full employment created by the Second World War economy, again, many people thought might disappear very rapidly, and there would be a return to pre-war deflation and pre-war mass unemployment. Now, many papers in this conference are dedicated to demonstrating how the RAF, as a service, negotiated this challenging post-war environment. And those speaking are much more, I think, qualified than I am to talk about any of this. What I want to do here is something slightly different. I want to look at the RAF flyers' transition from war to peace to highlight some particular aspects of, and again, to come back to Scheffer's quote, this tenuousness of the post-war world. And that will involve, I think, two dimensions. First, the sort of psychic dimension to the sense of post-war unsettlement. I want to dramatize this through talking about flyers confronting issues of survival and guilt. And these, I think, reveal a post-war emotional landscape in which the imperatives of post-war personal and social reconstruction struggle to assert themselves against the claims of an ongoing emotional obligation to the claims of wartime comradeship, even comradeship to those who are no longer alive. Secondly, I want to talk about the political aspect. I would argue that these years are characterized by the absence of a settled narrative about the political meanings of the RAF's wartime history. Narratives of the wartime RAF were claimed by both right and left of the political spectrum, put to work to justify political ideas as varied as the communitarianism of Leonard Cheshire, the Fabian technocratic meritocracy, Tory reformism, and free market conservative individualism. Now, the entry point to both of these aspects is a feature film released in 1946, which I'm sure is all very familiar to you, which is A Matter of Life and Death. Paul Pressburger's famous cinematic fantasy. Obviously, this is a film that's been discussed a great deal by film historians. It's also, I think, got a very important place in British culture more generally. It's interesting that actually when the BFI wrote to their members this summer saying, what would you like to be, when the South Bank British Film Institute screens reopen in the autumn, what would you like to come and see? This was one of the top picks, together, I think, with Pulp Fiction, Casablanca, Jaws, Snow White, and Singing in the Rain. So again, it has, I think, a place within actually the British national consciousness. And Matter of Life and Death has been discussed quite extensively by film historians and other writers who've used it to reflect on how it tells us a great deal about the kind of transition from war to peace, particularly the centrality of romantic love and the mutually supportive heterosexual couple's role in the reconstruction of national life now that the war was over. However, I think it also exposes another much more troubling motif related to the flyers' transition from war to peace, namely the complex and difficult negotiation of survival and guilt. Peter Carter, played by David Niven, having leapt from his stricken Lancaster without a parachute, insists that he was incorrectly chosen to die and claims the right to plead for his life in a heavenly court. At the beginning of the movie, Peter has flown 67 missions and has already come to terms with the fact he cannot expect to outlive the war. When he realizes that he may in fact have escaped a fate he had believed to be virtually foreordained, Peter is initially subject to an overwhelming sense of remorse that he's still alive after 6 years of war when so many of his comrades have died. Ultimately, however, Peter's passion for June, played by Kim Hunter, the control tower operator with whom he's fallen in love, restores his desire to live on after the war. Guilt at survival is abrogated, while love, not to say life itself, is joyfully embraced. However, the satisfactory outcome of A Matter of Life and Death should not blind us to the fact that other narratives press the disruptive claims of the flyers' dead comrades much harder, and suggest that the desire to retain some form of psychic or emotional fellowship with fallen brothers in arms remained an important element in the disposition of some flyers even after the war. In Walter Clapham's 1952 novel, Night Be My Witness, Johnny Summers, the former Wellington pilot bomb aimer, tells a friend that those, like himself, who had survived, had more in common with his deceased comrades than they did with those who had never, quote, brushed the fringes of the mystery in high places and saw the earth dwindling to a star. The Last Reunion, scripted by Kenneth Hyde and one of the first weekend dramas to appear on independent television in 1955, explored the agony of Simi, played by Eric Portman, a former wing commander who had accompanied a bomber crew on their last mission. While he had managed to survive, the crew had all been killed. Simi, burdened with remorse, finds himself, even 10 years later, unable to banish the ghosts of his deceased comrades and to escape what he terms the everlasting aeroplane in which the dead and the living remain trapped together for eternity. The necessity, now that the war had ended, of repudiating the self-approach which regularly beset those who found they were still alive at the end of hostilities was a significant motif in a number of fictional texts which appeared in the years 1945 to 49. However, these narratives tend to focus less on the mindset of former flyers, mourning comrades, and more on those of civilians who had lost flyboy lovers, brothers, and sons. Broken Journey, a 1947 film about a passenger plane which crashes in the Alps, featured Mary, played by Phyllis Calvert, a stewardess who was forced to come to terms with the fact that her idealization of a wartime romance with an RAF boyfriend who has been killed in action was ultimately an act of monstrous self-deception. She eventually understands the need to move on and allows herself to pursue a new and much healthier love affair with Bill, the co-pilot of the airliner on which she works. A much more agonized attempt to move out from under the shadow of the dead flyer is related in Mary Reynolds' 1949 novel North Face. Neil Langton, a schoolteacher, and Ellen Shortland meet while rock climbing in Devon after the war. They're both emotionally damaged, Neil by his wife's infidelity, and Ellen by the loss of her boyfriend, Jock, an RAF pilot killed over the Channel in 1940. Ellen's upset when they come from the body of a dead airman, washed up on the shore, his skull smashed open and still wearing his parachute harness. Neil tries to reassure her this is a recent death and cannot possibly be Jock's body. And Ellen is still traumatized. Ellen cannot reciprocate Neil's increasingly obvious attachment to her, telling him that she feels responsible for Jock's death. She refused to sleep with Jock and had, as a consequence, come to realize that she didn't really love him. However, she then tortured herself of what she believed to be her selfishness when Jock had been facing possible death. Having decided that she'll make herself love him, she writes a letter to Jock, agreeing to marry him. Unfortunately, she delays posting it, and in the meantime, Jock is killed in action. On receiving the news of his death, she experiences a strange sense of exaltation. It seemed everything was resolved between us, that I'd always loved him, and now that it is perfect and spiritual, and he must know it too. However, almost at once, a sort of shriveling light burst in, and Ellen knew that all this ecstasy really was. It was relief. This is why she has to reject Neil's love. She tells him, I can't feel any pleasure now without a sense of sin. When Neil finally convinces Ellen that she has no need to feel guilty, they consummate their relationship, and Ellen agrees to marry him, but not before he symbolically removes the St. Christopher medal that Jock had given her and places it on her bedside table. Now, narratives about guilt and survival require us to think more about the specific emotional moodscape of late 1940s Britain. The great majority of ex-RAF personnel, like their equivalents in the Army and Navy, successfully merged back into civilian life. However, a significant minority found readjustment difficult or even impossible. And I think, as a number of historians have pointed out recently, they actually proved a popular subject in post-war fiction and cinema. The idea of the sort of maladjusted ex-serviceman is actually quite an important theme in film and novels. Some obvious examples of this. A noirish Cavalcanti thriller, They Made Me a Fugitive, features the ex-flyer Clem, played by Trevor Howard, who drifts into the twilight worlds of gangland and the black market. The order here seems to have gone, but anyway. The hero of Escape, a 1948 film based on a play by John Galsworthy, is Matt Dennett, played by Rex Harrison, a former squadron leader who accidentally kills a detective in Hyde Park while protecting a woman from being wrongfully arrested. Now, I think the way that these films link the failure of post-war adjustment to peacetime male violence and therefore to some kind of, notion of psychological disturbance seem to be borne out by the high-profile trial and execution of Neville Heath, who, after all, had actually had a brief career in the South African Air Force and famously impersonated a glamorous RAF flyboy in order to ingratiate himself with women, including the two he murdered in a Ripper-like frenzy that captivated the British public in 1946. Now, some flyers longed for the company of their former comrades, but also longed again to experience again the excitement of flight. Some joined the expanding civilian airline sector after the war, or set up their own charter flying businesses in Australia or Canada. A small number of former RAF personnel made money in the late 1940s by illegally smuggling black market goods into rationing beset Britain from the continent using discarded RAF aircraft. One of the interesting things that came out this morning was the sort of sense of the rapid obsolescence of World War II aircraft in terms of the RAF's fighting capability. Those aircraft are still around and people found some rather nefarious uses for them. One group of flyers, faced with the prospect of immediate demobilization, simply collared the Mosquitoes and Beaufighters that they'd only recently been flying on operations and flew them to Israel, where they were gratefully received by a fledgling air force fighting a war of national survival against its Arab neighbors. Now, to reiterate, most former flyers successfully adjusted to peacetime life. However, it's important to appreciate that those who yearn for the male comradeship of wartime service, or who found it difficult to move on from a preoccupation with those who had not lived to see peace, reveals a psychic tension in British society which was played out at least at the level of personal interiority during these immediate post-war years. Post-war economic, social, cultural and personal reconstruction required former flyers to move forward, to face the challenges of rebuilding civilian society after the rupture of total war. I think the title of Labour's famous 1945 manifesto, Let Us Face the Future, I mean, that's actually a call to action, a sort of notion that one should try and move forward. Domesticity should be unequivocally embraced. The mundane tasks of daily life had to be taken up without complaint if Britain was to be rebuilt as an economy and a society. Now, this, I think, highly prescriptive regime, a highly moralized regime, was not without its rewards. If you played the game, you could look forward to full employment, expanded education, socialized medicine. There was a social contract here. But it did demand that the claims made on the former flyer from his past life, not least the claims made by memory and loss, had to be repudiated, banished, or at least not publicly acknowledged. In a matter of life and death, Peter Carter succeeds in doing just that, and his reward is a life of love and happiness. The dramatic tension of the film rests on the fact that audiences in 1946 knew only too well a renunciation of the psychic claims the dead made on the living was in no way straightforward or easily achievable. So let me return now to A Matter of Life and Death. Flight Lieutenant Peter Carter, as he shares with June his core values and beliefs as his Lancaster crashes down in flames, outlines some basic aspects of his character. He basically says his religious affiliation is Church of England. He gives her his mother's address. And he also says, he quips, "I am conservative by instinct, Labour by experience." Now, this line is regularly quoted in histories of the 1940s, where it's offered as a sort of, I think rather unreflectively, as a sort of clever verbal encapsulation of the leftward shift of British society during the Second World War. It actually strikes me as rather odd, because I think the phrase is actually full of ambiguity and indeterminacy. It actually raises, I think, more questions than it answers. What does Peter actually mean when he says conservative by instinct, Labour by experience? If he's changed direction politically during the war, why? What would an instinct to support the Conservatives look or feel like? What kind of experience has made him look more favourably upon Labour? These questions are not actually answered, either in the narrative of the film or elsewhere. Now, in the light of director Michael Powell's own, I think, sort of Tory political sympathies, it's hard not to see Peter as maybe a mystical romantic Tory, sort of poetic figure who's in some ways preoccupied with sort of the past and tradition. Although Peter's claim to life is based on a critique of an inflexible, bureaucratic, heavenly system. He claims they've messed up. He shouldn't die because basically a mistake was made in the bureaucracy of heaven. And this bureaucratic, heavenly system failed to account for the rights and desires of the individual. Now, this seems to me like, unimpeachably kind of Tory instincts. Peter, I think, reflects the resilience of a strong sense of romantic individualism in British society, which ran counter to Labour's statist collectivism. Indeed, as the end of the war approached, many of the flyers who gave serious consideration to pursuing a post-war career in politics, and there were quite a number of them, looked to the Conservative Party to further their ambitions. One of the dominant motifs of Guy Gibson's Enemy Coast Ahead, which was composed in 1943 to 1944, he writes it between leading the Dam Busters raid in 1943 and his own death in action in 1944, was actually the sort of necessity for the young who've done the fighting to wrest power from the old men whose failure in the interwar years had brought Britain to the brink of calamity in the first half of the war. And those of you familiar with the unexpurgated version of Enemy Coast Ahead will just know how violent that hostility Gibson has, I think, to the older generation. We have to remember just how young he was, Wing Commander at the age of 24. However, that didn't mean that he endorsed the guilty men model of the wartime British left, which also held the kind of interwar British leadership to account. Far from it. While still a serving officer, Gibson gave speeches to military audiences which made no attempt to conceal his partisan politics. He also shared platforms with controversial figure of Lord Vansittart. Gibson, of course, was one of Churchill's young men and inevitably benefited from the patronage of the Prime Minister. He was chosen as the Conservative Party candidate for the Macclesfield constituency. He later withdrew his candidacy and was killed in action before he could realise his post-war political ambition. Significantly, though, another name on the party selection list for the Macclesfield seat was Air Vice Marshal Donald Bennett, the 34-year-old leader of the elite Pathfinder bomber force. Now, Bennett's brand of Conservative politics were much more sophisticated than those of Gibson. I mean, Gibson actually gave a talk during the war, and the title, I kid you not, was The Amazing Empire. So I say Bennett much more sophisticated, while Gibson simply assumed that the Tories were the natural party of government and Britain had a right to rule the world. Bennett was more reflective, believing the war had revealed the need to embrace an agenda of, albeit managed, social change. Peter Townsend, despite being the cousin of a leading Labour politician, Hugh Gaitskell, also felt his loyalties lay with the Conservatives. Like Bennett, he had little sympathy for Gibson's reactionary and imperialist brand of Toryism, characterising himself as a pragmatic modern Conservative. Townsend allowed his name to be put forward as a candidate for a West Country seat, but he was clearly conflicted about the idea of entering Parliament. His ambivalence was sufficiently self-evident that the local party chairman said, "I think you should just drop the idea." Townsend chose instead to make a contribution to public life as a member of the royal household. King George VI wanted his new equerries to be selected on the basis not, as had been the case previously, of family or regional connections, but for their military records. In so doing, he failed to take into account the effect of the arrival of a dashing former fighter ace was to have on the sensibilities of the young and impressionable Princess Margaret, thereby sowing the seeds of a doomed romance which culminated in a royal scandal. Now, fighter pilots seem to have displayed particular predilection for the Conservatives. Laddie Lucas, a Spitfire pilot who had taken part in the Battle of Malta, was approached by Lord Beaverbrook at the end of the war and asked if he was interested in becoming a Tory MP. Lucas stood unsuccessful against Edith Summerskill, one of Labour's most prominent female leaders, in West Fulham during the 1945 general election. Douglas Bader, himself courted by a number of Conservative constituency associations, and a glittering array of fighter boy celebrities from RAF Tangmere came to speak on Lucas's behalf. But after a riotous meeting in which Bader was heckled, the government intervened to forbid serving officers from taking any further part in the election. In 1950, Lucas became MP for Brentford and Chiswick and was later offered a junior ministerial position, which he declined in favour of leaving Parliament to become the managing director of the Greyhound Racing Association. Douglas Bader was not the only disabled fighter pilot to favour the Conservatives. Colin Hodgkinson declared his experience of losing his legs had led him to believe that an excess of security led to the death of initiative. With such unimpeachably Tory sentiments, he was adopted as a Conservative candidate for Islington in 1955. A survey of former Battle of Britain fighter pilots actually revealed the vast majority of the few probably voted Conservative in the 1945 general election. John Collins, an RAF chaplain during the war, recalled the undisguised horror he encountered in many officers' messes to the news that Labour had won a landslide victory. And I quote Collins, "Was it for this, they seem to be saying to themselves, that the war had been fought and won?" Tory flyers insisted that their wartime experiences had made them suspicious of utopianism and had fostered an individualism that would be incompatible with Labour's collectivist vision. However, some observers, including J.B. Priestley, believe that the relative informality and classlessness of the wartime RAF station might prove a worthy model for the communal and egalitarian society the Labour Party sought to establish after the war. Indeed, the RAF's meritocratic and technocratic culture suggested an obvious affinity with Attlee's Labour Party, with its emphasis on social opportunity, economic efficiency, and dispassionate expertise. One prominent member of the RAF hierarchy, Shelton Douglas, was a lifelong Fabian socialist, taking the Labour whip when he entered the House of Lords in 1948. Most bomber air crew possessed a political outlook that's been characterized by one recent author as mildly skeptical socialism and belief in social justice. Left-leaning flyers who wanted to enter politics found Labour Party selection committees were sometimes ambivalent about the prospect of sending former servicemen to Westminster. Poet and writer John Putney, who was drafted into service of the RAF during the war, he's the person who famously wrote the poem for Johnny, which features in the film The Way to the Stars. John Putney was actually shortlisted for the North Paddington seat, where he faced a rigorous interrogation in the hands of a selection committee of what he termed elderly doctrinaire people with strong pacifist leanings, who cross-examined me about my blameless, almost non-competent RAF career as if I was still dripping with the blood of innocent Germans. However, it's significant that Dick Windle, Labour's national agent, was eager to exploit the glamour and heroism associated with the men in the RAF. Among former flyers who eventually became Labour MPs was Anthony Wedgwood Benn, who had not merely served as aircrew himself, but had a flyer brother who was killed in action, and a father, Lord Stansgate, who served as Secretary of State for Air in the 1945 Labour government. While these different political allegiances were the result of personal idiosyncrasies of the individuals concerned, they also dramatized our broader theme of post-war tenuousness, in the sense that they revealed there was no, in the immediate post-war years, no dominant, fixed political, cultural understanding of the RAF's wartime experience. Tory fighter pilots drew on the myth of romantic and often elitist individualism associated with the Battle of Britain, whereas former aircrew who leaned towards Labour emphasised the collective and collaborative endeavour of bomber crews, the RAF's apparent indifference to the formal hierarchies of the two senior services, and its self-conscious modernity. Now, I don't want to imply here there's a sort of a political split between fighter commanders Tory and bomber commanders Labour. Gibson and Bennett, of course, came from bomber command, although Gibson had famously spent the early part of the war actually in fighter command. We should also realise that it wasn't as if these national myths could not necessarily be appropriated by different sides of the political aisle. There's a really quite wonderful quote when Ernie Bevin, Labour's famous foreign secretary after 1945, was asked why he was not in favour of abolishing the private schools. He famously reported, I don't want anyone getting those boys at Eton, they won the Battle of Britain. The classic British war films of the 1950s, I mean, if we think about ones that feature the RAF, Angels 1-5, Reach for the Sky, The Dam Busters, might seem to have sort of clarified and embedded the cultural memory of the RAF's wartime experience. And if they did so, it was in a sort of largely sort of socially conservative direction. However, I think I want to be careful with this. Two things. First of all, I think a lot of very, very good recent research on 1950s British war films has really revealed just how complex and nuanced they are, and actually that they're not just kind of sort of boneheaded, sort of upper middle class Toryism. They do actually represent, I think, a much more sophisticated vision of Britain's experience during the war. But also we need to remember those films were made really from the mid-50s onwards. If we go back to the period between 1945 and 1949, I think we have a sense in which those kind of understandings of the war have not yet been fully established. The cultural meanings of the RAF's war, I think, were a matter of contestation and equivocation up until the early 1950s. And to give you an example of that, this ambivalence about the RAF's wartime achievement can be seen in the 1952 feature film inspired by the celebrity test pilots who flew the first generation of jet aircraft coming into existence in the late 1940s and early 1950s, which was discussed at some length this morning. Men such as Neville Duke, who was the test pilot on some of those planes that eventually became things like the Hawker Hunter. The Sound Barrier was the film in question. It was directed by David Lean. It was not one of David Lean's masterpieces by any stretch of the imagination. But it's quite interesting. In the film, it's a former Battle of Britain ace, Tony Garthwaite. He's played by Nigel Patrick. He's killed largely because he's an inspired amateur. He lacks the intelligence to handle modern technology. By contrast, the most successful test pilot is the uncharismatic Philip Peel, played by John Justin, a methodical and measured technical expert. Terence Rattigan, who wrote the screenplay, again, not one of his finest works either, recounted meeting real test pilots at Farnborough. They were, he concluded somewhat dolefully, quite young men, absolutely unlike the types I'd known during the war. The identification of the flyover technology, which had been tempered during the war by a sort of continued association with the chivalric tradition, had now become virtually absolute. And in the process, the glamour of flight seemed to have had sort of limited pertinence in the post-war world. We also need to realized that we should not discount the less than congenial legacy of the 1930s, when flyers had often been identified in the popular imagination with fascism and authoritarianism. The element of H.G. Wells's futuristic fantasy, The Shape of Things to Come, arrived as the philosophically illiterate saviors of civilization, but was soon revealed as narcissistic fascist strongmen. In Rex Warner's The Aerodrome, written during the Phony War, Air Force pilots are presented the sinister embodiment of the fascist man of action, callous and authoritarian technocrats, whose brutal discipline and ability to rise above the earth has encouraged them to believe that they were a new and more adequate race of men, who aimed to, quote, smash the civility of historical tradition by means of a coup against a government which was in the sway of what they called the money makers and sentimentalists. And needless to say, such associations as the fly with fascism rapidly diminished after the Battle of Britain. By the time Warner's dystopian parable was published in 1941, he felt obliged to include a prefatory disclaimer insisting that he had, quote, the utmost affection and respect for the RAF. However, I think residual anxieties remained. Kim, the air gunner in Arthur Gwyn Brown's 1945 novel Gone for a Burton, is hostile to a Britain which left him rotting in the slums and dedicates himself to the RAF, a genuine community which was, quote, the antithesis of drivelling democracy. In discussion with his skipper, Kim argues for the RAF as a model for a post-war society, in which everything, even child rearing, would be under the control of the state. Whereas those who knew the young men of the RAF dismissed the notion that the RAF might create a kind of fascist nursery, others remained uneasy about the Promethean omnipotence that might be fostered in young and impressionable men who were literally able to raise themselves above the mass of humanity. I think it's really important to remember that such concerns were not necessarily dissipated by the defeat of Hitler and Mussolini in 1945. Many contemporary commentators, writing in the immediate aftermath of the end of the war, saw fascist authoritarianism as a sort of near universal psychological condition, rooted in the individual personality, capable of existing independent of the political regimes that merely provided the pathology with its public articulation. So, so the death of fascism in the sense of as a political regime did not necessarily mean the disappearance of fascism from European society. And I think there's quite a lot of intellectuals and writers who are very preoccupied with that idea. And I think it's interesting because that provides a context, I think, to the notorious failure of Churchill to refer to the achievements of Bomber Command in his tribute to the British war effort on this 13th of May 1945 Victory in Europe broadcast. Because I think it has sort of, it carries certain intimations of anxiety about the flyer's potential identification as a callous agent of violent destruction. So it's this as yet unsettled world, both psychic and politically, that the RAF's ex-servicemen had to encounter. It's also, of course, the world in which those who remained in the service had to encounter, and also those who were joining the RAF for the first time with post-war national service were going to have to encounter too. So I think what I'm trying to sort of establish here is to think about this unsettled world, the sort of tenuousness of the post-war world, and how we need to think about the RAF's story between 1945 and 1949 in those terms. And maybe to encapsulate that, in the final chapter of Miles Tripps's 1952 semi-autobiographical novel Favours of Windsock, the crew of Lancaster A for Able find much to their surprise that they have survived the war. However, their sense of relief is then immediately tempered by melancholy at the unravelling of the ties of comradeship and by anxiety of what the future might hold. They faced, quote, uncertainty, readjustment and resettlement, words cumbersome in sound and meaning. Damocles' sword, Tripp asserted, was twisting in shape to a question mark. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Questions? I don't have any questions at the moment on the screen. Is it difficult to see out there at the moment? Does anybody in our audience present have any questions?
Hi, Martin. Really enjoyed the talk.
Oh, thank you.
When you mentioned the RAF pilots who went to fight in Israel, I thought that was a really interesting point because there does seem to have been a certain section of the RAF who perhaps didn't have the war they wanted or who, having experienced the war, couldn't move on. How typical was that in general? Or is that very much a small percentage, do you think?
I think there is a broader sort of sense of ambivalence about the return to peace. I think there's generally a feeling of issues to do with sort of potential maladjustment, I think, are quite widespread. But those who actually sort of actively wanted to not embrace the return to domesticity, to embrace the kind of return to peacetime, I think are a very, very small minority. But it is the fact that, obviously you've been in a institution for a number of years that has trained you to fight and kill, and then suddenly you're told to go back and make the peace, and that is a massive kind of challenge. In a way, it was easier for the RAF than it was for other services, because in some ways, as a sort of often of home-based service, many people have already actually continued to keep those kind of domestic ties. I mean, they've been able, in some senses, to have more relationship with civilian society than those people who are actually sent off abroad. I mean, I found sort of a lot of evidence that soldiers, particularly fought in North Africa, actually found readjustment much more difficult because they hadn't been home for any point during the war. So I would say it's a minority, but I think they do actually reveal a broader sort of sense of malaise, I think maybe is the way to put it.
I have one here from Abby Whitlock, who says, how would you describe the post-World War II RAF fighter pilot and the role they played in national consciousness, and the transition to peace differed from that of the pilot in the interwar years?
So,
she's added a couple of additional writers. Are there similarities? And she's thinking of films like A Matter of Life and Death and Dawn Patrol.
Right. I think it's a very, very good question. I think the interesting thing in a way is how after the First World War, in some ways, there was the sort of novelty of aerial warfare, and also, though, I think the particular pressure on people to try and establish a kind of myth of air combat as something sort of civilized and lofty, as opposed to the fact that, clearly in strategic senses, people were starting to think about air power more and more in terms of bombing and strategic bombing on civilians. It was possible to sort of keep that distinction in a way I think it hadn't become after the Second World War, simply because almost both, one had narratives of heroism, but one also had sort of narratives, I think, of violent destruction. I think the issues of readjustment after the First World War, of course, seemed to produce forms of political violence and extremism that then proved fatal for European democracy in the interwar period. So I think there's a definite effort to try in some ways to sort of delineate as quickly as possible a kind of a myth of fighter pilots in the Second World War that removes them from those kind of associations. Because obviously there is a definite link between aviation and fascism in the interwar period that was sort of certainly exploited by the fascist regimes themselves.
Yes, in the audience.
Yeah, hi. I was just wondering. You mentioned there was there's certainly some sort of concern about fascism. How was it concern or outright fear? And well, how widespread was it?
I wouldn't go so far as saying it's a fear, but I do. There's definitely a sense that people are now trying to explain what's actually happened to them. I mean, why has there been this trauma of fascism? Why has there been this trauma of war? And increasingly, people are drawn, I think, to models that are kind of sort of psychologically informed. So one of those interesting things is, this is there's a lot of stuff written after the war about sort of getting into the Nazi mind, trying to think about what's actually produced this. And this, of course, inevitably, once you get onto psychological models, what you're finding is there's an explanation that claims that, fascism is just a kind of particularly egregious version of authoritarian aspects of personality that are more widely shared. So then you get the sort of notion, well, if that's the case, then actually maybe it could happen again. So I think it's actually it's betoken of a sort of a growing sort of sense of a belief that the contingency of fascism shouldn't be allowed to sort of take away from the fact this could actually happen again. And one thinks a lot about the sort of notion of the political aspects of this too. I mean, the kind of debates over German rearmament, the sort of idea that actually not everybody's necessarily sort of embraced the kind of the sort of Cold War rhetoric just yet. And if you actually look at newspaper reports, it's quite interesting. There's a lot of coverage in particularly newspapers like the Daily Express in the late 40s and very early 50s about the rise of the far right in Germany, sort of talk of a new kind of emerging sort of proto-Führers among the, I mean, these are extremely obscure West German politicians who are sort of never heard of again, but there is a kind of sort of sense of that. There's a lot of discussion about Adenauer and about the kind of authoritarian aspects to his time at the, as German Bundeschancellor. So, you know, I think it's there. I said, the word I use is intimations. I don't think it's sort of necessarily a sort of fear, but I think there's sort of, there is, I think people are still working within those sort of discourse. I think what I'm trying to do in this paper is sort of not have us rush forward to this kind of idea that the Cold War is suddenly the new kind of meta-narrative. People are still dealing with other meta-narratives. And of course, you know, what happens is the fear of totalitarianism, and that emerges and gets applied in terms of political science in this period, is an attempt to try and yoke understanding of fascism onto an understanding of communism. So actually, you know, people are still trying to even look at Soviet communism through some kind of intellectual framework that's actually derived from thinking about fascism. I just don't think it goes away.
Okay, question here. Can you touch on the post-war RAFM establishing a new Air Force versus the for war-only men keen to get out, and a very different role for the Air Force, as we saw in the previous session?
Yeah, I mean, as I say, there's not as I say, there's not really an area of expertise. There's many more people around this room and indeed online who are much more qualified to talk about this than I am. But it is interesting that the expectations surrounding the RAF, I mean, I think, you know, quite wonderfully conveyed this morning, the planes start looking very different. The actual notion about what actually air combat or air warfare might involve is changed so rapidly and so dramatically. And so the strange thing about it is, of course, we do get transitional figures. I mean, Neville Duke is both a Second World War fighter pilot and a post-war test pilot. And of course, you know, many of the people who went on to who had significant careers during the war actually not very old when the war actually ends, and still play a very, very important role in the post-war system. But I think there's sort of definitely the idea, I mean, in terms of the popular understanding, I think a film like The Sound Barrier sort of really reveals maybe the idea that it's time to put aside those kind of wartime understandings and move towards something very, very different. I remember a long time ago looking at internal magazines that were produced for RAF national servicemen in the late 40s and early 1950s. And what struck me there was actually those magazines were really interesting in how they had narratives that seemed to sort of want to negotiate this change, because they were full of, half of the content was stories, uplifting stories about, you know, great things the RAF had done during World War II. Then the other half was about the sort of planes of the future and why we might be fighting in space in 10 years' time or something. And the two sat side by side, but there didn't seem to be any attempt to actually necessarily to think about how you were going to literally align one into the other. There was a kind of a sort of disconnect there, that people were both looking back and sort of looking forward, not necessarily looking at where the join would be, where you'd actually be able to sort of to stitch those two narratives together. So, but as I say, this is not, the post-war is not, RAF is not my field of expertise, so maybe somebody else can help out with that.
Some further questions. Given that the RAF had first choice of personnel for aircrew, what effect did the loss of so many high-quality men in Bomber Command have on post-war British society and industry? That's quite a narrow question for you, Martin.
Well, you know, it's interesting to think a little bit about the sort of ties between actually the sort of RAF and the industrial corporate world. I mean, I'm thinking about people like, you know, Douglas Bader going to work for Shell, although, you know, Bader is not a very helpful example because generationally he's much older than most wartime sort of RAF pilots and had an extended, you know, RAF career going back to the late 1920s. But I think, you know, the sort of idea of sort of I think that there isn't really obviously a sort of lost generation sort of a myth here, but you know, it's certainly the case. It'd be interesting. I think I guess my answer to this would be, it'd be interesting to look a little bit about the relationship between the RAF and things like technical colleges, and how far, you know, people felt they'd lost their very best exemplars of the new sort of technological education and so forth. But yeah, I mean, it's a difficult one to know. I mean, you know, most of these men were so young. We don't know what kind of world they would have. Sorry, we know what world they came back to. We don't know in what form they would have come back, or how far they would have I don't sort of sense anything. There certainly doesn't be some dominant cultural mythological understanding that there was a kind of lost generation in this sense. And indeed, obviously, one of the feelings was that the case for things like technical education, the case for research and development, these were strongly driven by the kind of example of the wartime RAF, I think.
I think it's also true to say, horrendous as the loss in Bomber Command was, with 55,000 people, that's not in the scale of First World War losses when you talk of a lost generation. 55,000 is not, it's horrendous in Bomber Command terms out of 120, but it's not impactful in the same way on society.
No, I think that's right. And also, I think we also have to realize that the actual sort of heterogeneous nature of the wartime RAF also meant that these losses were dispersed across other sort of national groups. This was a genuinely imperial service. So again, the sort of question is that your average Lancaster bombers crew could have New Zealanders, South Africans, and Australians. So again, these losses were actually sort of dissipated.
Yes, you're talking about 30,000 odd UK.
So the figures are really,
Okay, another question. Was there a difference in their approach to the transition to peace between ranks or between roles such as pilots and ground crew?
That's a very, very good question. Obviously, in some senses, the officers leave their voice. I think, and sometimes their sense of malaise might also be fed by factors that have less to do with their rank and more to do with their social class. So, it's quite obvious that many members of the upper middle class found the sort of Labour government burdensome at best and sort of repugnant at worst. So I think their levels of sort of disenchantment might have been higher. I imagine ground crew, most of the stuff I did on the wartime things, most of the ground crew seemed to provide quite clear testimony that they didn't necessarily like their wartime service, and were probably sort of glad to see the back of it. At the same time, in terms of the ordinary sort of officers versus sort of ranks, we don't really have that much. I think, the Imperial War Museum, most of their records and interviews are with usually with officers, or at least with NCOs. But I guess various veterans associations and so on would give you a sort of clearer take on that. My sense is that very, very few people wanted to get involved with veterans associations, but that was actually true in the First World War as well. Britain and France are very different in that regard. So I can't give a definitive answer on that, but I would say that I think we need to sort of, in some ways, we have to take our people out of uniform and put them in their other social contexts, and there I think we'll see that basically people tend to sort of represent the views that are more dominant among their social class. And I think it's important to note. I think that people who've written on the Labour government from leftish perspective, I think have actually seriously underestimated just how many members of the upper middle class really sort of found Labour quite loathsome, actually. Controversial view, I know.
Does early post-war analysis of mental health issues such as survivor guilt differ from our, one assumes, much different understanding to these issues today, or is research still referencing these early assessments?
Well, that's a very good question. Certainly the wartime understandings of trauma and the impact on mental health are I think, transitional. They are, there's a sort of sense in which one is moving beyond old-fashioned ideas of sort of, courage and cowardice as the two sort of binary points towards a much sort of greater understanding that all men will be subject to sort of pressure and may break down. But it was still, I think by today's standards, remarkably unsophisticated. And there is an interesting contrast between, those who suffered physical wounding during the war, who after all were, with Macindoe and the East Grinstead story, were sort of brought out into the community and were actually sort of put on show and people forced to recognize their sacrifice, to those that actually suffered from mental breakdown, who did not get that same sort of level of attention. It's still, but I think we need to remember, this is actually, I think the ability to talk openly about mental health among large sections of society is a very, very recent development. It is the case that, I think those of us who are getting on a bit in years actually will, still I think sort of will remember the kind of forms of guilt and anxiety and indeed sort of opprobrium that was sort of surrounding people who actually had mental health issues. So I think actually, in some ways, the RAF might seem by today's in the post-war period might seem remarkably callous, but I mean in a way that was in line with the sort of broader structures of and ideologies of the society which it actually existed in. So I think, it's a very, very different sort of world, but it was one that was certainly better than, say, post-1918. I think that's definitely the case.
I mean, the stiff upper lip was very much still the cultural
it was, although
knee-jerk reaction, if you like.
Yeah, it was, although I think what's interesting is that people were able to actually, I think, we've ended up with sort of issue that the stiff upper lip represses those emotions, where in fact, actually, I mean, I think audiences at the time watching a film like The Way to the Stars, which is probably the sort of classic Uber text of the stiff upper lip operating within RAF aircrew, we also have understood that there's a huge amount of emotion in there. But it's emotion which is sort of is projected in a particular kind of way, in a particular sort of controlled way. But the idea there's not an absence of emotion; it's just emotion not expressed in a sort of in the ways that we've come used to. So I think the sort of stiff upper lip is a slightly misleading sort of notion, because I think we have to understand that people didn't sort of understand it as a sort of denial of emotion. They understood it as a particular way of registering and actually articulating. I think the sort of emotion, we've reached a sort of point now where we seem to believe that our own emotional world is so much more sophisticated than that in the past, that people in the past were all in some ways repressed or something, or had sort of emotional cultures and landscapes that were inadequate. And I think that's actually kind of something of something sort of misleading. And I think we all know that, those of us who work on wartime RAF, know for the fact that you can't read these texts without feeling the kind of overwhelming sort of sense of emotion that often sort of lies underneath them.
There's a question in the audience.
Yeah, thank you. You highlighted Matter of Life and Death, and you said that British Film Institute members now rated it very highly.
Yeah.
Could you say a little about how that film, maybe others, were perceived at the time, both critically and by cinema goers? And did it change over time in the immediate post-war years, or did it also depend on what the content was, whether it was an action film or kind of more nuanced? Thank you.
No, that's a very good question. I mean, what, the besetting sin of all cultural historians is to talk about is to overdetermine the significance of texts without actually saying how they're received. I think Matter of Life and Death is interesting. It has a premiere with members of the royal family. It gets a massive amount of publicity. There's actually a book of the film that's actually sort of published. It's sort of seen as, in part, as a sort of prestige project about the kind of re-emergence of the British film industry after the war. It has a sort of, it obviously has a sort of, it's technically sophisticated. In terms of contemporary audiences seem to like it. I mean, obviously, I don't think they necessarily invested it. I think they saw it more as a kind of sort of whimsical piece. They didn't invest it with the sort of, maybe with the sort of the heavyweight intellectual apparatus that I've sort of put around it. It certainly, I think, was with David Niven, it had a major star. It certainly, Powell and Pressburger, by this point, I think, are regarded as sort of Britain's two best director producers. So I think it did get quite a lot of attraction. At the same time, I mean, obviously, people are like, this is the last great golden age of cinema going. People are going in large numbers, and they're seeing lots and lots of films. And I think, we have to sort of remember that, people didn't often have that long to digest or internalize what they're seeing on the screen, because a couple of days later they were coming to see another one. The large, huge numbers of viewers of film in this period are adolescent boys who, probably prefer the action film. So, I think you're right. One has to be a little bit careful about thinking about that. But I do think it's a film that it did catch a moment. I mean, if you look at a lot of the contemporary reviews, press coverage, certainly the sort of stuff that the production company itself produced, they clearly knew they could tap into a debate about the kind of post-war world and about what the kind of needs and desires of those who'd fought actually were going to be. So I think it captured a mood. There were probably also those, you say, thousands of people who didn't actually ever see it. And I think one of the sort of besetting sins we always have to remember is that we all love British film from this period. I mean, it is a great golden age of British film, but the great majority of films that people watch were from Hollywood, and had very, very different takes on it. And if you think about it, I mean, there were probably more people who saw days of their lives, best years of their lives, which obviously is a kind of American rendering about how servicemen can sort of reintegrate into civilian life, than probably saw any British film that dealt with the same theme. So I don't know if you were being skeptical in your question, but if you were, you're probably right to be so.
Do you know if there were significant differences in the post-war experiences of RAF personnel compared to those of the United States Army Air Force?
One thing we do know is that the coming back to actually the question about issues to do with breakdown and mental health, we know that the American Air Force did much more elaborate investigations into sort of psychological trauma and the impact of that. I think one of the interesting issues here is that the U.S. aircraft. I mean, for a start, there's a sort of sense in which you have a very strange moment in the US, which is sort of 1945 into 1946, where literally the American side almost seems to sort of entirely demobilize very, very quickly, sort of mentally very, very quickly. And then it immediately starts to remobilize in a kind of militarized way as the sort of Cold War sort of hots up by about 1947. So I think there's a sort of strange thing that probably the kind of dominant cultural pressures were really to get people out of uniform and get them back into the civilian economy. And then they had to sort of switch that thing around. I don't know. I'm not an expert on the American stuff to know again how many people chose to continue their career actually after the war. But again, it comes back. I think again something that came through very much this morning. I mean, the issue of obsolescence is really quite interesting, both of people and of airplanes. I mean, coming back to the best years of their lives, there's a wonderful opening scene in that in which these returning veterans fly over this huge field. As they're flying to this city in the Midwest of the United States, that is just literally full of basically abandoned B-17 flying fortresses, just like hundreds of them. And the sort of sense of actually kind of everyone I think sort of faced the fact that actually this to come back to this theme of this conference, that this world had sort of transformed, and I don't think in the United States they're any more prepared for that than they were in Britain.
Many of the senior figures in the Tory governments of the 70s and 80s, Heath, Whitelaw, Carrington, Pym, etc., were former junior wartime officers, but none were from the RAF. The only ex-RAF man who achieved any authority was Tony Benn, I think, and I wonder if there's any significance to that.
Yeah, that's actually a very good point. That might have a lot to do with. I mean, it's interesting, coming back to thinking about Laddie Lucas. I mean, he sort of, quit to do other things. It could have something to do with the age profile of RAF people who joined the Conservatives, and it might also be, I think, in part, the idea that actually maybe sort of RAF idiosyncrasy and individualism made it much more difficult to sort of play the political game. I mean, in some ways, the experience of people like Heath and Whitelaw was much more about working within the parameters of the party. I mean, I wonder about, it's interesting, Gibson's interest in the sort of Conservative Party. I mean, how much did he actually know about, Conservative Party policies on, if you like, the Beveridge report or anything of this period is probably fairly unlikely. Also, I mean, interestingly, one can actually think about I think one does also think about a little bit about the imperial relationship to this, because obviously there was a sense in which former flyers actually became more prominent in other places, right? I mean, Ian Smith is probably if we think about somebody who had a very significant post-war political career, Ian Smith as a former sort of fighter pilot actually, was a head of state and indeed a very important figure in the kind of the ongoing debate about the issue of the end of the British Empire. So. I think it might just, I can't think of any sort of particularly general explanatory model for this, but it might just be sort of chance. But I think it is a good point that, I mean, that legacy didn't really kind of continue for into the sort of 60s and 70s.
Paul Stollart's come back on the question of, did the loss of the 55 officers and NCOs in Bomber Command exceed that of junior officers in World War I? Is the issue not so much the absolute number, but the lost potential of people of that caliber? which
well,
Eric Grove has also very much agreed with.
Yeah. No, well, I mean, yes, exactly. I mean, I mean, yeah. If you're going to make comparison for the types of loss, I mean, that is such a difficult question. I mean, I think the point I was just trying to make is that, you know, what was quantitative loss versus qualitative loss. But in both world wars, the question is that after the First World War, there was a notion that a particular quality was lost, that the men who were lost had the potential to be a kind of, you know, to provide a political, social leadership that was then sort of taken away. I don't think anybody made those claims about the Second World War, right? I mean, there's a sort of sense in which, even if you can argue that we could also make a claim for a sort of similar loss of sort of qualitative leadership potential, nobody built that into a sort of ongoing sort of narrative. I mean, if one thinks about, you know, Stanley Baldwin famously sort of said, you know, in the early 1930s, the only reason I'm here running the country is because all those other people died. And I don't think, you know, anybody made those claims in Britain in the 1950s or 1960s. I don't think there was that same kind of feeling. I think the thing we also have to remember is that actually the ongoing shadow of the First World War is enormous. I mean, there is a sort of sense in which the Second World War is always viewed through, I think, the lens of the first. I mean, if we think about Harold Macmillan, I mean, for him, the First World War was the kind of formative tragedy of the 20th century, and for him, his whole kind of emotional structure, his relationship between politics and social action, and his Tory paternalism is deeply rooted in the First World War. So I think, again, you know, there was still a generation of people in the post-war period who were still negotiating the impact of that war before they even had to deal with the second one. And I think that's sort of something, again, thinking about the sort of claims, coming back to my sort of notion about the sort of contested nature of the meaning of the Second World War, we have to realize that many people still had pressing claims to the First World War. They still had one, you know, they still mourned people they'd lost from that war before the next war came along. I mean, the Second World War wasn't able to entirely totalize people's understanding about war and its impact on society.
We have another question in the audience.
Thank you very much. I wanted to follow up a little bit on the empire question and broadening it out to post-war immigration. I mean, it's rather striking, the case that Ian Smith that you mentioned. Arthur Harris goes to South Africa. Yeah. Frank Whittle goes to the United States. You mentioned people setting up in business in Canada and Australia. Is there any possibility that RAF aircrew were more likely to emigrate than other groups after the war? After all, there is a great emigration out of the UK after 1945.
I mean, it's not a topic I've actually explored in depth, but somebody should, because I mean there is this sort of interesting, you know, sense, as you say, that emigration was probably as much a significant social development in the post-war period as immigration. I mean, obviously, I think there are sort of, you know, many people came out the wartime RAF and sort of, you know, were still inspired by the kind of myth of the frontier. You know, at a less congenial and I think a sort of quite unsalubrious element was also a kind of sort of the fellowship of white flyers that sort of developed when people then started sort of, you know, getting in touch with their former adversaries in the Luftwaffe. I mean, Bader I know is a sort of slightly exaggerated example, but he has some utterly repellent, you know, German friends. Many of them sort of unapologetic sort of Nazis, and the sort of, I think the sort of creation of a kind of, you know, a sort of fraternity of white flyers that was then sort of set against the idea of kind of sort of Britain becoming a sort of increasingly a multiracial society, and one that many of these people did not wish to embrace. I think is actually sort of quite important. I'm not trying to imply that, you know, all former flyers were sort of unreconstructed racists, but there is, I think, something here about the idea that actually those sort of post-war formations, you know, tied to immigration, links to sort of notion of kinds of settler societies, did come in part from some idea that actually, you know, that the battle over civilization in the Second World War in some ways now had to sort of take a backseat to a broader battle between European civilization and either Soviet communism on one side or kind of atavistic black insurgency within the imperial context as well. I mean, I do think there is that aspect. Yeah.
And it's worth noting in this context that Frank Whittle and Barnes Wallis both addressed the Monday Club in the 1960s. And indeed, Frank Whittle intervened in a notorious election and by-election in 1964 on behalf of a racist candidate.
Yeah, right. Yeah, so some of these. I mean, interesting thing there, I guess, is the sort of link between the wartime experience, but also I think, sort of notions of sort of technology and advancement and the kind of sort of the sort of model of civilization defending itself against primitivism, which is sort of quite.
Do we have any more from the audience? I don't have anything on my screen at the moment, so. I'm happy if you're happy, Harry. In which case, it only remains for me to thank Martin for what was a very stimulating session. So thank you very much indeed.
And can I just say thank you to everybody for their questions. I'm sorry if I didn't answer some of them as fully as I could, but I hope the conversation continues. And as I say, thank you everybody, those of you who've come, and also those people who asked questions online. They were some very, very good questions. So thank you so much.
They were. Thank you to everybody whose questions have been taken.
Okay, Martin, before you go, I'd just like to add absolute tour de force. Really great. We've got a small present for you, which Seb is going to do the honours with.
Thank you. I have no idea, Martin, what is hidden in this, so I take no responsibility at all.
Dive in, Seb.
And I will avoid the usual handshake for the usual reasons.
Oh,
So,
thank you. I love the bag. That's good.
yeah.
Available from the shop, I hope. I'm not taking a commission here, but it's thank you. Oh wow! Oh my goodness! It's a bag of goodies.
Box of chocolates.
This is. I mean, it's. But next time you see me out and about on the tube on the Northern Line,
The 80th anniversary of the Battle of Britain. Very appropriate.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you.